Welcome to Her Journey, where every story is a testament to the power of perseverance, hope, and the unstoppable spirit of women. Here, we share true tales of resilience and reinvention, stories that prove no matter how dark the night, a woman's dawn can always break through. If you believe in the beauty of comebacks and the power of second chances, you're in the right place. Today, we bring you the extraordinary story of Chantel Morrison, a woman who discovered that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find yourself. The fifth time my husband called me a useless wife, I was changing his paralyzed father's diaper at 3 in the morning. My hands were shaking not from the cold, but from 47 years of swallowed words finally rising to my throat like bile. My name is Chantel Morrison, and this is the story of how being called useless became the most useful thing that ever happened to me. The words hung in the darkness of that cramped bedroom, mixing with the smell of disinfectant and the sound of labored breathing from the hospital bed. I had been a wife for 47 years, a caregiver for 12, and myself for exactly 0 days. That was about to change in ways I never could have imagined. If stories of resilience, transformation, and a woman's quiet revolution through courage inspire you, please subscribe to Her Journey and hit the notification bell so you never miss a tale that just might change your life. Because what happened next defied everything I thought I knew about starting over at 72. My story begins in a 2-bedroom ranch house in Bakersfield, California, where the summer heat makes mirages on the asphalt and dreams feel just as impossible to catch. I had lived in that house for 32 years, watching the neighborhood change from young families to retirees, from hope to resignation, from possibility to routine. At 72, I had perfected the art of invisible living. My days began at 5:30 with the first of many medication alarms, followed by the careful choreography of caring for Harold's father, Frank, who had been living with us since his stroke 12 years ago. Frank Morrison was 87 and required round-the-clock care that our insurance barely covered, and our marriage couldn't survive. I would start each morning by checking Frank's oxygen levels, adjusting his position to prevent bed sores, and preparing his pureed breakfast while Harold sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone and commenting on everything wrong with the world. Harold, at 74, had retired from his job at the water department 8 years ago and seemed to believe that his new full-time occupation was critiquing my every move. "The coffee's too weak again, Chantel," he would say without looking up from his screen. "And did you remember to give Dad his blood pressure medication? Last time you forgot, his numbers were all over the place." I never forgot Frank's medication. Not once in 12 years. But Harold needed someone to blame for his father's condition, for the cramped house, for the way our golden years had turned into a prison of bedpan schedules and physical therapy appointments. My own children, David and Sarah, lived their busy lives in Los Angeles and Phoenix, respectively. They called every few weeks, their voices bright with guilt and relief that they lived far enough away to avoid the daily grind of elder care. "You're such a saint, Mom," Sarah would say. "I don't know how you do it." David would add, "Dad's lucky to have you." But neither offered to help, and I had stopped asking. The truth was, I had become a ghost in my own life. My days were measured in pill dispensers and meal schedules, my nights broken by monitor alarms and the sound of Frank calling out in his sleep. I hadn't read a book in years, hadn't seen a movie, hadn't had a conversation that didn't revolve around medical appointments or insurance claims. I used to paint watercolors, mostly landscapes and still lives that I would set up on the kitchen table when Harold was at work and Frank was napping. I had been good at it too. Good enough that my friend Linda had suggested I enter a few pieces in the county fair. But the art supplies had been boxed up years ago to make room for medical equipment, and my easel had been replaced by a wheelchair ramp. Sometimes, when I was folding Harold's laundry or preparing Frank's dinner, I would catch a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror and wonder who that tired woman was. Her hair had gone completely gray, pulled back in a practical ponytail that hadn't changed style in decades. Her clothes were chosen for functionality, cardigans that washed easily and pants with elastic waistbands that wouldn't restrict her movement when she needed to lift or transfer Frank. The woman in the mirror looked like she had given up, and maybe she had. Maybe we both had. But there were moments, brief as lightning, when something else flickered in those tired eyes. Usually it happened when I was alone with Frank during his lucid periods, when he would grab my hand with surprising strength and say, "You're a good woman, Chantel. Better than any of us deserve." Those moments reminded me that I used to be someone, that somewhere inside this exhausted caregiver was a person with dreams and opinions and desires. The last time I had expressed a desire out loud, it had been about a watercolor class at the community center. I had seen the flyer while waiting for Frank's physical therapy appointment, and something about the image of paintbrushes and palettes made my heart race with forgotten excitement. When I mentioned it to Harold that evening, he had laughed, a sound without humor. "Art class? Chantel, you can barely keep up with Dad's care schedule. When exactly would you have time for hobbies?" The word hobbies dripped with disdain, as if my longing for creativity was childish and selfish. That night, I had thrown the flyer away, but not before memorizing the class times and wondering what colors I would choose first if I could paint again. Cerulean blue for hope. Cadmium yellow for the warmth I used to feel when creating something beautiful. Alizarin crimson for the passion I had buried beneath decades of practical necessity. I should have known that the woman who still dreamed in watercolors was stronger than she appeared. I should have known that 47 years of being useful to everyone else had taught me exactly how much I was worth. But I didn't know it yet, not consciously. That knowledge was still sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up and change everything. Looking back now, I can see the signs that my breaking point was approaching. The way my jaw clenched when Harold criticized my housekeeping. The way my chest tightened when Sarah called asking for updates on Frank, but never asking how I was doing. The way I lingered in the grocery store, savoring the 20 minutes when I could pretend I was a regular person choosing items for myself instead of managing someone else's dietary restrictions. Most telling of all was the way I had started talking to myself. Not the absent-minded muttering of someone getting older, but actual conversations with the woman I used to be. Remember when we painted that sunset over the mountains? I would whisper while preparing Frank's breakfast. Remember how proud we felt when Linda said we had real talent? These conversations usually ended with me shaking my head and returning to the endless tasks that filled my days. But the conversations were getting longer, more frequent, more insistent. The woman I used to be was getting restless, pushing against the boundaries of the life I had accepted as unchangeable. The house itself seemed to reflect our diminished circumstances. What had once been a cheerful family home had become a medical facility. The living room was dominated by Frank's hospital bed and equipment. The hallway was cluttered with wheelchairs and walkers and mobility aids. The kitchen counter was covered with pill organizers and medical supplies. Every room told the same story. This was a place where life was maintained, not lived. Where comfort meant the absence of pain rather than the presence of joy. Where love had been reduced to duty, and duty had worn us all down to nothing. Harold and I barely spoke anymore except about practical matters. When was Frank's next appointment? Had I ordered his prescription refills? Did we need more adult diapers? Our conversations had become as functional as my wardrobe, stripped of anything that might suggest we were actual people with inner lives and secret dreams. I had accepted this gradual erasure as the natural order of things. This was what wives did, what mothers did, what women did. We sacrificed our own desires for the greater good of the family. We made ourselves smaller so others could be more comfortable. We disappeared so quietly that even we didn't notice we were gone. But somewhere deep inside me, in a place I thought had gone quiet forever, a different voice was beginning to stir. It was the voice of the young woman who had believed she could do anything, who had painted pictures that made people stop and stare, who had once looked in the mirror and seen infinite possibility. That voice was about to get very loud, very quickly. And when it did, it would shatter the careful illusion that I could continue living this half-life forever. The moment was coming faster than I could have imagined, and it would arrive wrapped in the cruelest words my husband had ever spoken. The crisis that shattered my world didn't arrive with fanfare or warning. It came on a Tuesday morning in March, disguised as just another ordinary day in our extraordinary dysfunction. Frank had been having a particularly difficult week, his confusion worse than usual, his physical needs more demanding. I had been up 3 times the night before, helping him to the bathroom, adjusting his pillows, calming him when he forgot where he was, and called out for his deceased wife, Margaret. Harold had been complaining about the disruption to his sleep, as if caring for his father was somehow my hobby rather than our shared responsibility. He had taken to sleeping in the living room recliner, claiming Frank's nighttime needs were keeping him awake, which left me to handle everything alone in the darkness. That Tuesday morning started like all the others, but there was something different in the air, a tension that felt electric and dangerous. Frank needed to be bathed, a process that required careful maneuvering and infinite patience. His dignity was important to me, even when it was inconvenient, so I took my time, talking to him gently as I helped him wash, keeping him covered and warm. "Good morning, sunshine," I said, using the pet name his wife Margaret had called him for 60 years. It sometimes helped him remember who he was, where he was, that he was loved. Frank smiled, one of his rare moments of clarity breaking through the fog of his condition. "Margaret?" he asked hopefully. "No, it's Chantel, Frank. I'm taking care of you today." His face fell slightly, but he nodded with the patient acceptance he had developed over the years. "You're a good girl, Chantel. Harold doesn't deserve you." The comment hit me like a small electric shock. Even in his confused state, Frank could see what Harold couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. Harold appeared in the doorway as I was helping Frank put on a fresh shirt, his face already dark with the irritation that had become his default expression. "You're taking too long," he said, his voice sharp with impatience. "I need to get to the hardware store before they get busy." "Almost finished," I replied, focusing on buttoning Frank's shirt with arthritic fingers that had become clumsy over the years. The small buttons were difficult to manage, and Frank's limited mobility made the process slow. "That's what you always say. Everything takes you twice as long as it should." The criticism stung, because it was so unfair. I was managing complex medical care with no formal training, and I had become skilled at it through necessity and dedication. But to Harold, my careful attention to his father's comfort and dignity was simply inefficiency. I bit back my response and continued dressing Frank, who was looking between us with the confused expression he wore when he sensed tension but couldn't understand its source. His eyes, still sharp despite his cognitive decline, seemed to be trying to protect me from something he couldn't quite identify. The morning continued with its familiar rhythm of medications, breakfast, and the careful transfer from bed to wheelchair. Frank was having one of his better days, alert enough to appreciate the scrambled eggs I had made just the way he liked them, with a touch of cheese and pepper. He even managed to feed himself, something that always made me proud of his determination to maintain independence wherever possible. Harold sat at the kitchen table, eating his cereal and scrolling through news articles on his tablet, periodically sharing his outrage about politicians and weather patterns as if I were his personal audience. I had learned to make appropriate sounds of agreement without really listening, a skill that had taken years to perfect. "This country is going to hell," he muttered, stabbing at his screen. "Nothing works right anymore. Nobody does their job properly." I continued cleaning up the breakfast dishes, wondering if he realized how those words landed when directed at someone who spent every waking hour doing unpaid, unrecognized work. The breaking point came during lunch preparation. Frank had spilled his morning juice on his shirt, and I was changing him again when Harold walked into the bedroom, his face dark with irritation that seemed to have intensified throughout the morning. "The kitchen's a mess," he announced, as if this were breaking news rather than the natural result of preparing 3 meals a day for an elderly man with special dietary needs. "There are dishes everywhere, and you haven't even started lunch." "I'll get to it as soon as I finish helping your father," I said, not looking up from the task of getting Frank's arms through the sleeves of a clean shirt. Frank was tired and less cooperative than he had been in the morning, making the process more difficult. "When, Chantel?" "When exactly? Because it's already past noon, and nothing ever gets done around here." Something in his tone made me pause. There was a cruelty in it that I hadn't heard before, a deliberate meanness that felt like a physical slap. I turned to face him, Frank's shirt still half unbuttoned in my hands. "I'm doing my best, Harold." "Your best?" He laughed, that same humorless sound I had grown to dread. "Your best isn't good enough, Chantel. It hasn't been good enough for years." The words hit me like physical blows, each one finding its mark in the tender places where my self-doubt lived. But he wasn't finished destroying me. "You're a useless wife," he said, the words deliberate and clear, designed to cause maximum damage. "Useless? You can't keep house, you can't cook a decent meal, and you sure as hell can't take proper care of my father." Frank made a small sound of protest, but Harold continued, his voice rising with each accusation as if he had been storing up these grievances for years. "Look at this place. Look at yourself. When's the last time you brushed your hair properly? When's the last time you wore something that wasn't stained or wrinkled? You're useless, Chantel. Completely useless." The silence that followed was deafening. Frank was staring at his son with an expression of shock and disappointment that cut through his confusion like a knife. I stood frozen, Frank's shirt still clutched in my hands, the weight of those words settling into my bones like poison. Harold seemed satisfied with the devastation he had caused and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there with the echo of "useless" ringing in my ears. But this was only the beginning. Over the next 4 days, he said it 4 more times, as if he had discovered a weapon that caused me exquisite pain and couldn't resist using it. The second time came the next morning when I burned the edges of his toast while simultaneously managing Frank's morning medications. "Useless wife can't even make breakfast right," he said, scraping the burned bits into the trash with theatrical disgust. The third time was Thursday afternoon when I accidentally dropped Frank's medication and had to retrieve it from under the bed, a process that required getting on my hands and knees and reaching into the dusty space beneath the hospital bed. "Useless wife, always making everything harder," Harold observed from the doorway, making no move to help. The fourth time came Friday evening when I suggested we hire someone to help with Frank's care, at least part-time, so I could have a few hours of respite each week. "What would be the point?" Harold asked with a sneer. "One useless woman is the same as another." Each time he said it, something inside me died a little more. But something else, something I didn't recognize yet, was being born. It was small and quiet at first, like a spark in a pile of kindling, but it was growing stronger with each casual cruelty. The fifth time came at 3 in the morning on Saturday, as I was changing Frank's diaper after another accident. These nighttime incidents had become more frequent as his condition progressed, and they were always the most difficult part of caregiving. I was exhausted, my back aching from the awkward position, my hands cramping from the repetitive motions of cleaning and changing sheets in the dark. Harold appeared in the doorway, his hair disheveled from sleep, his face twisted with a kind of annoyance usually reserved for minor inconveniences like traffic jams or long lines at the store. "What's all the noise?" he demanded, as if Frank's medical needs were a personal affront designed to ruin his rest. "Frank had an accident," I whispered, trying not to wake him further. "I'm just cleaning him up." "Again? Christ, Chantel, can't you keep him on a schedule? This is happening every night now." It's not something I can control, Harold. It's part of his condition. The doctor explained that incontinence gets worse as the brain damage progresses. Everything's part of something with you, isn't it? Always an excuse for why you can't do your job right. I continued working, trying to preserve Frank's dignity while my husband berated me. Frank's eyes were open, looking at me with an expression of profound sadness, as if he understood that his care was causing me pain and wished he could spare me from it. "You're a useless wife," Harold said, his voice carrying clearly in the small room. Useless. I don't know why I've put up with this for so long. And that's when it happened. That's when 47 years of swallowed words, buried dreams, and diminished expectations finally reached their breaking point. The woman who had painted watercolors and laughed with friends and once believed she deserved better suddenly woke up inside the body of the tired caregiver. The transformation was so sudden and complete that I felt like I was watching someone else take control of my body. I finished changing Frank's diaper with steady hands, pulled his blanket up to his chin with gentle care, and then turned to face my husband with eyes that he had never seen before. "You're right," I said, my voice calm and clear as mountain water. "I am useless. To you." Harold's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to confusion. This wasn't the script he expected. For 47 years, I had absorbed his criticism and tried harder. I had apologized and promised to do better. I had never, ever agreed with him. What's that supposed to mean? I walked to Frank's dresser with deliberate calm, opened the top drawer, and pulled out a week's worth of adult diapers. I placed them carefully on Harold's chest, along with Frank's evening medications and the detailed care schedule I had maintained for 12 years. "It means he's all yours now," I said with the kind of quiet authority I hadn't used since I was a young woman who believed her opinions mattered. All of it. The diapers, the medications, the 3 a.m. wake-up calls, the bathing, the feeding, the physical therapy appointments, the insurance claims, the doctor visits. Everything. Harold stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. "Chantel, what are you talking about? You can't just..."
Can't what?
"Can't stop being useless?" "You're absolutely right. I can't be useless anymore. Not to myself." I walked to the bedroom closet and pulled out the small suitcase I had used for weekend trips in the early years of our marriage, back when we still took weekend trips, back when we still enjoyed each other's company. "Where do you think you're going?" Harold's voice had lost its cruel edge and taken on a note of panic that I found surprisingly satisfying. "I don't know yet," I said, and realized it was the most honest thing I had said in years. "But I know where I'm not going. I'm not going to spend whatever years I have left being called useless by someone who wouldn't last a day doing what I do." Frank was watching this exchange with increasing alertness, his eyes bright with something that might have been pride. For a moment, his confusion seemed to lift completely, and he looked like the sharp, intelligent man he had been before the stroke. "You can't leave," Harold said, but his voice had lost its authority. The man who had been so confident in his power over me suddenly sounded small and afraid. "Who's going to take care of Dad? Who's going to run the house? Who's going to manage all the medical stuff?" I zipped up the suitcase, my hands steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "That's not my problem anymore," I said. "You've made it very clear that I'm useless at all of those things. So now you get to find out what useful looks like." I walked to Frank's bedside and took his hand. His grip was stronger than it had been in months, as if witnessing my rebellion had given him strength.
"I'm sorry," he whispered.
"You deserved better care than a useless wife could give you." Frank squeezed my hand with surprising strength and looked directly into my eyes with the clearest expression I had seen from him in years. "You," he said slowly but distinctly, his voice barely a whisper but his words unmistakable, "are not useless. You are the best thing that happened to this family." The tears I had been holding back for 12 years finally broke free, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of a woman finally seeing herself clearly after decades of looking through someone else's eyes. Harold was still standing there, holding the diapers and medications like props in a play he didn't understand, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Chantel, be reasonable. You can't just walk out. What about your responsibilities? What about our marriage? What about everything we've built together?" I turned to face him one last time, this man who had shared my bed and my life for 47 years but had never really seen me, never really valued what I brought to our partnership. "Our marriage ended the first time you called me useless," I said. "I was just too useful to notice." And then I walked out of that bedroom, down the hallway where my ghost had lived for so many years, and toward the front door that I hadn't opened for myself in longer than I could remember. Behind me, I could hear Harold calling my name, his voice cracking with the realization that useful wasn't something you could replace with a classified ad. I heard him trying to soothe Frank, who had begun calling out in distress, and I almost turned back. Almost. But I didn't turn around. I couldn't, because for the first time in 47 years, I was walking towards something instead of away from it, even though I had no idea what that something was. All I knew was that it wouldn't involve being useful to people who found me useless. And that knowledge, terrifying as it was, felt like freedom. As I reached for the front door handle, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me was still tired, still gray, still wearing practical clothes that had seen better days. But her eyes were different. They were awake. They were angry. They were alive. And for the first time in decades, they were looking forward instead of down. I opened the door and stepped into the night air, leaving behind 47 years of diminishment and walking toward whatever came next. I had no plan, no destination, no idea how a 72-year-old woman with no income and no recent work experience was going to survive on her own. But I had something I hadn't possessed in years, the absolute certainty that I was worth more than I had been receiving. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything. The first night in the budget motel off Highway 99 was the longest of my life. I sat on the edge of a bed that smelled like industrial disinfectant and decades of other people's desperation, staring at the water-stained ceiling and wondering what the hell I had done. The room was a testament to broken dreams and temporary solutions. The carpet was worn thin in paths between the bed and bathroom, marked by countless people who had found themselves in circumstances they never could have imagined. The walls were beige, that soul-crushing color of institutional neglect. The single window looked out onto a parking lot where broken streetlights cast uneven shadows across cars that had seen better decades. My phone had been buzzing constantly since I left the house 8 hours earlier. Harold's calls had evolved from angry demands that I stop this nonsense and come home, to panicked pleas when he realized that Frank needed his evening medications, and Harold didn't know which pills were which, or what time they should be administered. I had turned the phone off after the 15th call, but I could still feel it vibrating in my purse like a caged animal desperate for escape. Each buzz felt like an accusation, a reminder of the responsibilities I had abandoned, the mess I had left behind. The reality of my situation hit me in waves, each one more devastating than the last. I had no plan, no destination, and exactly $437 in my personal checking account. The joint savings Harold and I shared required both signatures for withdrawals over $500, something that had never mattered before because I never spent money on anything that wasn't for the house or Frank's care. I had been so focused on the dramatic gesture of leaving that I hadn't considered the practical implications. Where would I go? What would I do? How does a 72-year-old woman with no recent work experience and no independent income survive in a world that had changed completely since she was last part of it? The mirror in the motel bathroom reflected a stranger back at me. Harold's words echoed in the fluorescent light. "When's the last time you brushed your hair properly?" My hair was indeed a mess, gray and limp, pulled back with a rubber band I had found in the kitchen drawer that morning, back when I still had a kitchen to find things in. My clothes were exactly what he had criticized, practical and shapeless, chosen for their ability to withstand the rigors of caregiving rather than their appearance. The cardigan had a small stain on the front from Frank's breakfast that I hadn't noticed until now. The pants were wrinkled from sitting in the car for hours, driving aimlessly until I found this motel. But it was my face that shocked me most. When had I become so invisible? The woman in the mirror looked like she had been gradually erased, features faded, eyes empty of hope or expectation. She looked like someone who had given up so slowly that she hadn't noticed a happening, like a photograph left too long in the sun. I sat back on the bed and forced myself to think practically. I had enough money for maybe a week in this motel if I was careful about food and avoided any unnecessary expenses. After that, I would need to either return home with my tail between my legs or figure out how to survive on my own. The thought of going back made my stomach clench with panic. I could picture Harold's smug satisfaction, his "I told you so" expression, the way he would hold this failed rebellion over my head for whatever years we had left together. I could see myself settling back into the routine of medication schedules and bedpan changes, but now with the added burden of knowing I had tried to escape and failed. Worse, I could imagine the conversation.
See?
I told you that you were useless. You can't even run away properly. You can't survive without me. You need me to take care of you, because you're completely helpless. The humiliation would be worse than the original abuse. At least before, I had been able to maintain some dignity in my own mind, some sense that I was choosing to sacrifice for the good of the family. Now I would know that I was trapped not by nobility, but by incompetence. But staying meant figuring out how to be a person again, and I wasn't sure I remembered how. I had spent so many years defining myself in relation to other people's needs that I had forgotten what my own needs even were, let alone how to meet them. I tried calling Sarah, my daughter in Phoenix, but the conversation went exactly as I expected, which is to say it was a disaster. "Mom, what's going on?" Dad called me freaking out, saying you just left. "Where are you?" "I'm in a motel, Sarah." I needed some time to think. "A motel?" "Mom, that's crazy. You can't just abandon Grandpa Frank. Who's going to take care of him?" Dad doesn't know anything about his medications or his schedule or any of that stuff. The assumption that Frank's care was automatically my responsibility, even for my own daughter, felt like another slap. It hadn't occurred to her that Harold could learn these things, that he should have been learning them all along. "Your father is perfectly capable of caring for his own father," I said, hearing my voice get sharper. "He's not incompetent, just lazy." "Mom, that's not fair. Dad worked hard his whole life. He deserves to enjoy his retirement." "And what about me, Sarah? What do I deserve?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. There was a long pause before she answered. "Well, you deserve to be with your family. You deserve the satisfaction of taking care of the people you love. Isn't that what you've always wanted?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "I haven't been asked what I wanted in so long that I've forgotten. This isn't like you, Mom. You're scaring me. Just come home and we'll figure out how to get you some help with Grandpa, okay?" Help with Grandpa. Not help for me, not recognition that I might need support or rest or a break from 12 years of round-the-clock caregiving. Help with Grandpa, as if I were a piece of medical equipment that had malfunctioned and needed repair. I hung up and turned the phone off again, but the conversation replayed in my mind for hours. My own daughter couldn't see me as a person separate from my role as caregiver. I was Grandpa Frank's keeper, Harold's unpaid nurse, the family's solution to an inconvenient problem. But I wasn't a woman with my own dreams and needs and right to happiness. The next few days blurred together in a haze of cheap coffee and cable television. I couldn't bring myself to leave the motel room during daylight hours, convinced that everyone could see my failure written on my face. Instead, I watched talk shows and game shows, programs I hadn't seen in years, and marveled at how bright and confident the people on television looked. The women my age who appeared on these shows were vibrant and engaged, talking about their book clubs and travel plans and grandchildren's achievements. They wore jewelry and lipstick and clothes that suggested they had places to go and people to see. They looked like they mattered to themselves. One afternoon, I watched a cooking show hosted by a woman who had to be in her 70s, but moved through her kitchen with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she wanted to create. She talked about ingredients like they were old friends, about techniques she had perfected over decades of passionate practice. The secret to a perfect soufflé, she said, whisking eggs with practiced ease, is believing that you deserve to eat something beautiful. The comment hit me like a physical blow. When was the last time I had cooked something simply because I thought it would taste good? When was the last time I had eaten something beautiful, something that existed purely for pleasure rather than nutrition or convenience? I tried to remember the last time I had felt like I mattered to myself. The memory was so distant it felt like something that had happened to someone else, like a story I had heard secondhand about a woman who might have been me in another lifetime. By the fourth day, my money was running dangerously low, and I was forced to venture out to find a cheaper place to stay. The extended stay motel I found was even more depressing than the first one, but it was half the price and included a tiny kitchenette where I could prepare simple meals instead of living on vending machine food. The kitchenette was barely functional: a hot plate, a microwave that looked older than my grandchildren, a mini refrigerator that hummed ominously in the corner. But it was mine to use however I wanted, and that felt like a small miracle. I bought basic groceries at the dollar store: bread, peanut butter, canned soup, instant coffee. Nothing fancy, nothing beautiful, just fuel to keep my body functioning while I figured out what to do next. But even choosing these simple items felt revolutionary. I could buy smooth peanut butter instead of crunchy, because I preferred it. I could choose the soup I wanted instead of the one that met Harold's dietary restrictions. I called David, my son in Los Angeles, hoping for a different response than I had gotten from Sarah. I should have known better. "Mom, this is insane," he said without preamble. "Dad says you've lost your mind. Sarah thinks you're having some kind of breakdown." "Maybe I am having a breakdown," I said. "Maybe I needed to break down a breakthrough." Break through to what? Being homeless? "Mom, you're 72 years old. You can't just start over at 72.
Can't.
The word hung in the air, like a verdict.
Can't leave.
Can't start over. Can't matter to yourself. Can't expect better. Can't. Why not? I asked. The question seemed to confuse him. "What do you mean, why not?" "Because you're not 22, Mom. Because you have responsibilities. Because you have a family that needs you." "A family that calls me useless," I said quietly. Dad was just frustrated. You know how hard it's been for him dealing with Grandpa's condition. He didn't mean it, but he did mean it. That was the truth I was finally ready to face. Harold had meant every word, and my children's inability to see that, their rush to excuse his cruelty and minimize my pain, showed me exactly where I ranked in our family hierarchy. I was the useful one, the one who absorbed the stress and managed the difficult tasks and made everyone else's life easier. But I wasn't the valued one, the one whose feelings mattered or whose dreams were worth considering. I was infrastructure like plumbing or electrical wiring, essential but invisible, noticed only when something went wrong. That night, I sat on the narrow bed in my depressing motel room and forced myself to take inventory. I had no job skills that were relevant to today's economy. I had no recent references, no professional network, no portfolio of achievements outside of keeping house and caring for others. I had a high school education from the 1960s and a handful of community college art classes from the 1970s. I had no independent credit history because everything had always been in Harold's name. I had no retirement savings of my own because my contribution to our family had never been measured in dollars. I had no close friends because friendships required time and emotional energy I hadn't had to spare. The practical obstacles to independent living at my age were staggering. Who would rent an apartment to an unemployed 72-year-old woman? Who would hire someone who hadn't worked outside the home in decades? How would I navigate a world of online applications and electronic everything when I barely knew how to use a smartphone? The despair that settled over me during those first weeks was unlike anything I had experienced before. It wasn't the sharp pain of loss or betrayal, but the dull ache of realizing that the life I had built was completely unsustainable without the framework of usefulness that had defined me. I had been so focused on escaping Harold's cruelty that I hadn't considered what I was escaping to. Now, sitting alone in a room that wasn't mine, eating meals from the dollar store, I wondered if Harold had been right about me all along. Maybe I was useless. Maybe useful was all I had ever been good at, and without that role, I was nothing. The worst part was the silence. For 12 years, my life had been filled with constant noise. Monitor alarms, medication reminders, Harold's complaints, Frank's confused calls for help. The silence in the motel room was deafening, broken only by the hum of the ancient air conditioning unit and the occasional sound of traffic on the highway. In that silence, I could hear my own thoughts for the first time in years, and they weren't kind. "You're a fool," they whispered. "You're too old for this. You don't know how to be anything except a caregiver. You're going to end up homeless, alone, forgotten." I started having panic attacks in the middle of the night, waking up gasping and disoriented, convinced I had forgotten to give Frank his evening medications before remembering that Frank was no longer my responsibility. The realization brought relief and guilt in equal measure. Who was taking care of him now? Was Harold managing the complex schedule of pills and treatments? Was Frank confused and frightened by the change in routine? Was he asking for me? These questions tormented me more than my own uncertain future. I had invested 12 years of my life in Frank's well-being, and walking away felt like abandoning a child. Even though I knew rationally that he was Harold's father and Harold's responsibility, emotionally I felt like I had failed in the most fundamental way. The guilt was eating me alive, made worse by the constant calls I ignored from Harold. His voicemails started angry and demanding, but gradually became desperate and pleading. "Chantel, this is ridiculous. Dad won't eat anything I make. He keeps asking for you. The doctor's office called about his appointment next week, and I don't know what they're talking about. Just come home, and we'll work this out." Each message made my chest tighten with anxiety and regret. I had walked out in a moment of righteous anger, but now I was facing the consequences of that decision, and they were overwhelming. On the 10th day, I finally hit rock bottom. I was down to my last $20. My phone battery was dead because I couldn't afford to replace the charger I had forgotten at home, and I had eaten nothing but peanut butter sandwiches for 3 days straight. I sat in the parking lot of a grocery store, watching families load their cars with food they had chosen together, and realized I had never felt more alone in my life. I wasn't just physically isolated. I was existentially adrift, cut off from every anchor that had given my life meaning. That's when I saw her, an elderly woman, probably about my age, struggling to load heavy grocery bags into the trunk of an old car. Without thinking, I got out of my car and walked over to help her. "Let me get that for you," I said, taking the heaviest bag from her hands. She looked surprised but grateful. "Thank you, dear. My arthritis is acting up today." "I understand," I said, meaning it. "I have the same problem." As I helped her arrange the bags in her trunk, she studied my face with the kind of attention I hadn't received in years. "You look like you're having a rough time," she said gently. "Are you okay?" The simple question, asked with genuine concern by a complete stranger, broke something open inside me. I started crying right there in the grocery store parking lot. ugly sobs that came from a place deeper than I knew existed. The woman, whose name I learned was Betty, didn't try to stop my tears or offer empty reassurances. She just stood there and let me cry, occasionally patting my shoulder with a weathered hand that felt like comfort itself. "I don't know what I'm doing," I finally managed to say. "I left my husband, and I don't know how to live on my own. I'm 72 years old, and I feel like I'm starting from nothing." Betty nodded as if this made perfect sense. "How long were you married?" 47 years. "Children?"
2.
"But they think I've lost my mind." "Have you?" The question caught me off guard. "I don't know. Maybe." Betty smiled, and her whole face transformed. "Well, if you have, maybe that's not such a bad thing. Sometimes losing your mind is the only way to find your soul." She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card that looked like it had been handled many times. "There's a place," she said, "for women like us. Women who need to figure out who they are when they're not taking care of everyone else." It saved my life when my husband died, and I realized I didn't know how to be a person without being a wife. I took the card with shaking hands. "Silver Connections," it read. "Empowering women 50 plus to create their next chapter." "They have classes," Betty continued. "Computer skills, job training, financial planning. But more than that, they have people who understand what it's like to start over when you thought your story was already written." "I can't afford classes," I said. "It's free. Everything is free. Even lunch." Betty's eyes twinkled. "And let me tell you, the lunch is better than anything you'll get at the senior center." That night, I lay in my narrow motel bed and stared at Betty's business card. For the first time since I had walked out of Harold's house, I felt something other than despair or panic. I felt possibility. It was a tiny spark, barely noticeable against the overwhelming darkness of my situation. But it was there, warm and steady, like a candle lit in a window to guide someone home. I thought about Betty, who had lost her husband after 43 years of marriage and somehow found a way to build a new life. If she could do it, maybe I could too. Maybe Harold had been wrong about me. Maybe useful wasn't the same as valuable, and maybe valuable wasn't something someone else got to decide about me. I folded the business card carefully and put it on the nightstand where I would see it first thing in the morning. Monday suddenly felt full of promise instead of just another day to survive. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night without waking up in a panic about what I had done. And when I woke up, the first thought in my head wasn't regret or fear. It was curiosity about what I might learn about myself. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that usually made me want to stay inside and avoid the world. But I was up before dawn, my stomach churning with a mixture of anticipation and terror that I hadn't felt since my first day of high school 56 years ago. I spent an hour trying to decide what to wear, a problem I hadn't faced in years. My wardrobe consisted entirely of clothes chosen for practicality: elastic waistbands, stain-resistant fabrics, cardigans that could be thrown in the washing machine without thought. Nothing in my small collection suggested that I was someone who deserved to learn new things or meet new people. Finally, I settled on my least wrinkled pair of pants and a sweater that wasn't completely shapeless. I looked in the mirror and saw a nervous 72-year-old woman who was trying very hard to look like she belonged somewhere other than a laundromat or a doctor's waiting room. It would have to do. The community center was a low, brick building surrounded by parking lots and landscaping that had seen better decades. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, watching other people walk through the main entrance with confidence and purpose, wondering if I could turn around and drive back to the motel without anyone noticing. Then I saw Betty approaching the building, her silver hair catching the weak morning light, and I forced myself to get out of the car. "Chantel," she called, waving as if we were old friends. "I was hoping you'd come." The warmth in her voice gave me the courage to walk toward the building instead of running away. I'm terrified, I admitted as we approached the entrance together. Good, Betty said. That means you're doing something important. The classroom was smaller than I had expected, arranged with round tables instead of rows of desks. About 15 people were already seated, most of them women, most of them around my age or older. They looked like me, uncertain, hopeful, trying to figure out how to be someone new after decades of being someone else. The instructor, a woman named Patricia, who appeared to be in her early 60s, had the kind of calm energy that comes from years of helping people navigate difficult transitions. She welcomed each person individually, asking their names and what had brought them to the program. When she got to me, I found myself saying, "I'm Chantel, and I'm here because I finally got tired of being called useless." The words hung in the air for a moment, and then Patricia smiled with genuine warmth. "Well, Chantel, you've come to the right place. We specialize in helping people discover just how useful they really are." She handed out folders containing schedules, resource lists, and worksheets. Today we're going to start with something simple but powerful, defining who you are outside of your roles and relationships. I want you to think about this question. If you couldn't describe yourself as someone's wife, mother, daughter, or caregiver, how would you introduce yourself? The question hit me like a physical blow. I had been Mrs. Harold Morrison for so long that I wasn't sure I remembered who Chantel was. When people asked me about myself, I talked about Frank's medical needs or Harold's retirement or my children's careers. I had become a supporting character in everyone else's story. Patricia gave us 10 minutes to write down our thoughts. I stared at the blank paper, my mind equally blank. Who was I if I wasn't useful to someone else? Around me, I could hear pens moving across paper, but I couldn't think of a single thing to write. The silence stretched on until panic began to set in. What if I really was nothing without my role as caregiver? What if Harold had been right about me all along? Finally, in desperation, I wrote, "I used to paint." It was such a small thing, but seeing it on paper felt revolutionary. I used to paint. I used to have opinions about colors and compositions. I used to create things that existed purely because I wanted them to exist, not because someone else needed them. When Patricia asked for volunteers to share, I surprised myself by raising my hand. "I wrote that I used to paint," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I haven't touched a paintbrush in 12 years, but I still remember how it felt to mix colors and watch a blank canvas become something beautiful. The woman next to me, whose name was Linda, nodded vigorously. "I used to garden," she said. "Not just vegetables for the family, but flowers. I grew flowers just because they were pretty and they made me happy." Around the table, other women began sharing forgotten pieces of themselves. One had been in a book club before her husband decided it was a waste of time. Another had played piano until the instrument was sold to make room for medical equipment. A third had volunteered at the animal shelter until family obligations made the schedule impossible. We were a room full of women who had been erased so gradually that we hadn't noticed it happening until we were gone. "Here's what I want you to understand," Patricia said when we had all shared.
Those parts of yourself didn't die.
They've been waiting, and it's never too late to reclaim them or to discover new parts of yourself you didn't know existed. The computer class that followed was humbling and frustrating and oddly exhilarating. I had avoided technology for so long that even turning on the computer felt like a major accomplishment. The instructor, a patient young man named Alex, walked us through the basics. How to use a mouse, how to open programs, how to navigate the internet. I felt clumsy and slow, my fingers awkward on the keyboard, my eyes straining to read the small text on the screen. Several times I wanted to give up, convinced that I was too old to learn something so foreign. But Linda, sitting beside me, was struggling with the same challenges, and somehow her presence made my own difficulties feel less shameful. "This is harder than it looks," Linda said when she accidentally deleted an entire paragraph she had been typing. But we're doing it, I replied, and realized it was true. We were doing something new, something that had seemed impossible an hour earlier. When I successfully sent my first email to a practice address Alex had set up for us, I felt a surge of pride that surprised me with its intensity. It was such a small thing, but it proved that I could learn, that my brain wasn't too old or too set in its ways to acquire new skills. The financial planning session in the afternoon was both enlightening and devastating. Patricia walked us through the realities of starting over financially later in life. How to establish credit in your own name, how to apply for benefits you might be entitled to, how to create a budget when your income is limited. I learned that I was probably eligible for spousal Social Security benefits even if Harold and I divorced, something I had never known. I learned about programs that provided assistance with housing and health care for low-income seniors. I learned that my situation, while difficult, wasn't hopeless. But I also learned how financially vulnerable I was. Without income or credit history or savings in my own name, I was essentially starting from zero at an age when most people were settled into retirement. It's going to be hard, Patricia said during the break, when she noticed my overwhelmed expression. I won't lie to you about that. But it's not impossible. I've seen women in their 70s and 80s completely rebuild their lives. It takes time and persistence and a willingness to ask for help, but it can be done. How long does it usually take? I asked. That depends on what you mean by it, she said. Financial stability? Maybe a year or two if you're able to find some kind of work. Emotional recovery from a major life change? That's different for everyone. But feeling like yourself again, like you matter and have value beyond what you can do for other people? That can start today if you let it. During the lunch break, I found myself sitting with Linda and two other women, Janet and Rose. Linda had been widowed 5 years earlier and was trying to figure out how to live on Social Security. Janet had divorced her husband of 38 years after discovering he had been having affairs for decades. Rose had been taking care of her mother with dementia for 8 years and was considering placing her in a care facility. I feel so guilty, Rose was saying. Mom's sacrificed everything for our family, and now I'm thinking about putting her in a home so I can have a life. That's not selfish, Janet said firmly. That's survival. You can't pour from an empty cup. But people will judge me, Rose continued. They'll think I'm a bad daughter. I found myself speaking up. The only person whose opinion matters is yours, I said. I spent 47 years trying to be what everyone else needed me to be, and you know what I got for it? Called useless. If you're going to be judged anyway, you might as well be judged for living your own life. The words surprised me as much as they surprised the others. When had I become someone who gave advice about living authentically? When had I developed opinions about self-care and boundaries? But the other women were nodding in recognition, and I realized I had touched on something universal. We had all sacrificed ourselves for other people's comfort, and we were all struggling with the guilt of finally putting ourselves first. That evening, I sat in my motel room with a notebook and tried to make a plan. It felt strange to think about my future as something I had control over, something I could shape according to my own desires and needs. I wrote down everything I had learned that day, everything I wanted to explore further. Computer skills to develop, job possibilities to research, programs to apply for. And at the bottom of the list, almost as an afterthought, I wrote, buy art supplies. It seemed frivolous given my circumstances, but something about putting it on paper made it feel possible. Maybe, when I had figured out the practical necessities of survival, I could allow myself to want something purely for the joy of it. My phone rang as I was reviewing my notes. Harold's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered not answering. But I was curious about how he was managing without his useless wife. Chantel, thank God, he said when I picked up. I've been trying to reach you for days. What do you need, Harold? I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. I need you to come home. This whole thing has gotten out of hand. Dad's confused without you here, and I can't manage all his medications. The house is falling apart. Have you considered hiring professional help? With what money? And besides, strangers don't know Dad's routines like you do. I almost laughed. His routines. The routines I had established and maintained for 12 years, that Harold had never bothered to learn because he knew I would always be there to handle them. You'll figure it out, I said. Chantel, be reasonable. You've made your point. I know I was wrong to call you, to say what I said.
I'm sorry.
But this has gone far enough. The apology I had wanted to hear for weeks felt hollow now, delivered not out of genuine remorse, but out of desperation. He wasn't sorry for how he had treated me. He was sorry for the consequences of that treatment. I'm not trying to make a point, Harold. I'm trying to make a life. At 72? Come on, Chantel. You're not 20. You can't just start over. There was that word again.
Can't.
The word that had defined my existence for so long that I had forgotten it was a choice rather than a fact. Watch me, I said, and hung up. I turned off the phone and sat in the quiet of my small room, feeling something I hadn't experienced in decades, the satisfaction of choosing myself first. Tomorrow I would go back to class and learn more about computers and budgets and possibilities. I would continue the slow, difficult work of figuring out who Chantel was when she wasn't being useful to everyone else. But tonight, I was simply proud of myself for showing up, for trying, for believing that I was worth the effort of starting over. Betty had been right. Sometimes losing your mind is the only way to find your soul. And I was beginning to discover that my soul had been waiting patiently all these years for me to remember it existed. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, a beginning is all you need to change everything. 6 weeks into the Silver Connections program, I experienced my first moment of genuine confidence in decades. I was helping Linda troubleshoot her email account when I realized that not only did I understand what was wrong, but I knew how to fix it. Try refreshing the browser, I suggested, leaning over to point at the correct icon. Sometimes the connection gets stuck and needs a fresh start. Linda followed my advice, and her inbox populated with messages she had been unable to access for 3 days. Chantel, you're a lifesaver, she exclaimed. How did you know that? The question stopped me cold. How did I know that? When had I learned enough about computers to help someone else solve a problem? More importantly, when had I become the kind of person others turned to for help instead of the person who always needed rescuing? Patricia, who had been watching the exchange, smiled at my confused expression. You're surprised by your own competence, she observed. That happens a lot. We get so used to feeling helpless that we don't notice when we stop being helpless. She was right. Over the past 6 weeks, I had been absorbing information and skills without fully recognizing my growing confidence. I could navigate the internet with ease now, send emails with attachments, even do basic troubleshooting when things went wrong. What had seemed impossibly complex 6 weeks ago now felt manageable, even routine. But it wasn't just the technical skills that were changing. I was changing in ways that surprised and sometimes frightened me. The previous week, during our job search workshop, Patricia had asked us to practice interviewing each other. When it was my turn to be interviewed, Linda asked me to describe my greatest professional accomplishment. For a moment, I had panicked. I didn't have professional accomplishments in the traditional sense. I had never been promoted or received awards or managed teams of people. But then I thought about Frank, about the 12 years of complex medical management I had handled with minimal training and no support. I coordinated the medical care for a man with multiple chronic conditions, I said slowly, the words feeling strange in my mouth. I managed his medications, scheduled his appointments with 7 different specialists, advocated for him when insurance tried to deny coverage, and helped him maintain his dignity and quality of life during a very difficult period. As I spoke, I saw Linda's expression change from polite attention to genuine admiration. That's incredible, she said. How many patients were you managing? Just one, but nothing. You were essentially functioning as a case manager for a medically complex patient. Do you have any idea how valuable those skills are? I didn't, but I was beginning to learn. Patricia had encouraged several of us to look into jobs in healthcare support, elder services, or social work. You have real-world experience that many people with degrees don't have, she explained. You understand the healthcare system from the patient side. You know how to communicate with elderly people and their families. You've managed crisis situations and complex logistics. These are incredibly valuable skills. The revelation that my caregiving experience could be viewed as professional expertise rather than simply what wives do was transformative. For the first time in my adult life, I began to see my work as work, deserving of recognition and compensation. This new perspective gave me the courage to apply for my first job in 47 years. The position was at a local senior center, providing support to elderly people and their families as they navigated healthcare and social services. The pay wasn't much, barely above minimum wage, but it was something. More importantly, it was work that felt meaningful, work that valued the skills I had developed through years of struggle. The interview was scheduled for a Thursday morning, and I spent the previous 3 days preparing. I practiced answering questions with Linda and Janet, who had become not just classmates, but genuine friends. I researched the organization and prepared thoughtful questions about their programs and philosophy. Most importantly, I went shopping for interview clothes. Standing in the dressing room at a discount department store, looking at myself in a blazer that actually fit properly, I barely recognized the woman in the mirror. She looked professional, competent, like someone who might have valuable skills to offer. The blazer was navy blue, a color I hadn't worn in years because Harold had once said it made me look washed out. But looking at myself now, I thought it made me look serious and trustworthy, like someone you might want to trust with important responsibilities. I bought the blazer, along with a matching skirt and a white blouse that made me feel like the career woman I had never been but was apparently becoming. The total cost was more than I had spent on myself in years, but for the first time, it felt like an investment rather than an indulgence. The interview went better than I had dared to hope. The director, a woman named Jennifer who appeared to be in her 40s, listened carefully as I described my experience caring for Frank. She asked thoughtful questions about how I had handled various challenges, and I found myself talking with confidence about medication management, insurance advocacy, and crisis intervention. "What interests you about this position?" she asked. "I want to use what I've learned to help other families," I said. "I know how isolating and overwhelming it can be to navigate the healthcare system alone. I know what it feels like to need help and not know where to find it. I think I could make a real difference for people in those situations." Jennifer smiled. "You sound like exactly what we need. The families we serve are dealing with complex situations, and they need someone who understands what they're going through from personal experience, not just textbook knowledge." She offered me the job on the spot. Walking out of that building, clutching the employee handbook and my new name badge, I felt like I was floating. For the first time since I was 17 years old, I would have an income that wasn't dependent on someone else's approval or generosity. I would be doing work that mattered, work that recognized and valued the expertise I had gained through decades of service. That evening, Linda, Janet, Rose, and I celebrated at a small Italian restaurant Linda had discovered. It was nothing fancy, but to me it felt like the finest dining I had ever experienced. Not because of the food, though it was delicious, but because of the company and the reason for celebrating. "I'm so proud of you," Rose said, raising her glass of wine. "6 weeks ago, you were convinced you had no skills. Now look at you." "We all have skills," I replied. "We just weren't taught to recognize them as valuable." Janet nodded vigorously. "For 38 years, I managed a household budget, coordinated schedules for 4 kids, planned meals and shopping and vacations. But when I got divorced, I was told I had no work experience. That's changing, though, Linda added. Slowly, but it's changing. Programs like this one, organizations that recognize what we've learned through caregiving, employers who value life experience. It's not perfect, but it's progress. I looked around the table at these women who had become so important to me in such a short time. 6 weeks ago, we had been strangers united only by our shared sense of loss and confusion. Now we were friends, supporters, witnesses to each other's transformation. Can I tell you something? I said. This is the first time in decades that I've had dinner with friends. Harold never wanted to socialize, and Frank's needs made it impossible to go out. I had forgotten what it felt like to talk and laugh with people who saw me as a person rather than a service provider. Well, get used to it, Rose said with a grin. Because you're stuck with us now. The simple statement made my eyes well up with unexpected tears.
Stuck with them.
What a beautiful concept. People who chose to be in my life not because they needed something from me, but because they enjoyed my company. My phone buzzed with a text from David, my son in Los Angeles. Mom, Sarah told me about your new job. I wanted to say I'm proud of you. I didn't understand what you were doing when you left Dad, but maybe I was wrong. Maybe you knew something we didn't. The message was brief, but it represented a shift in how my children saw me. For the first time, they were acknowledging that I might have reasons for my choices that went beyond stubbornness or breakdown. Another text came in, this one from Sarah. Congratulations on the job, Mom. I still think you should come home, but I'm glad you're taking care of yourself. Taking care of yourself. Such a simple phrase, but it represented a fundamental change in how my daughter thought about my responsibilities. For the first time, she was acknowledging that I had a responsibility to myself, not just to everyone else. That night, I sat in my small apartment, my new apartment that I had rented with the security deposit for my first paycheck. It was tiny, barely 500 square feet, but it was mine. The walls were white and bare, waiting for me to decide how to fill them. The refrigerator held food I had chosen because I wanted it, not because it met someone else's dietary restrictions. I had moved out of the extended stay motel the week before, a transition that felt almost as significant as leaving Harold's house. The motel had been about survival, the apartment was about living. Standing in my tiny bathroom, applying lipstick for the first time in months, I looked at the woman in the mirror and saw someone I was beginning to recognize. She had the same gray hair and lined face, but her eyes were different. They looked awake, alert, like someone who expected good things to happen. My first day at the Kern County Senior Resource Center arrived with the crisp clarity of an October morning. I woke up before my alarm, my body humming with an energy I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in decades, I was waking up to go somewhere I wanted to be, to do work that mattered. The senior center was housed in a converted school building with high ceilings and large windows that filled the space with natural light. Jennifer met me at the front desk with a warm smile and a cup of coffee. "Ready for your first day?" she asked. "I think so," I said and realized I meant it. My desk was small but functional, with a computer, a phone, and a nameplate that read Chantel Morrison, Family Resource Advocate. Seeing my name in print, attached to a title that suggested expertise and authority, made my chest tighten with emotion. Jennifer introduced me to my colleagues, Maria, who ran the transportation program, Robert, who coordinated meals and nutrition services, and Diana, who managed volunteers and community outreach. They welcomed me with the easy camaraderie of people who genuinely enjoyed their work and each other. Chantel will be helping families navigate healthcare and social services, Jennifer explained. She brings extensive hands-on experience in caregiving and medical advocacy. The phrase extensive experience applied to me felt revolutionary. For so long, my caregiving had been characterized as simple duty, unremarkable and undervalued. Here, it was being recognized as expertise. My first client was Mrs. Helen Kim, an 83-year-old woman whose husband had recently been diagnosed with dementia. She sat across from my desk, her hands shaking as she tried to organize a stack of medical papers and insurance forms. "I don't understand any of this," she said, her voice cracking with frustration. "The doctors keep saying things I don't understand, and the insurance company keeps denying things they used to cover. I worked as a teacher for 37 years, and I feel like I can't read my own language anymore." Looking at her, I saw myself 12 years earlier, overwhelmed by Frank's diagnosis and the sudden complexity of medical decision-making. But now, instead of being the one drowning in confusion, I was the one throwing the lifeline. "Let's go through this together," I said, spreading the papers across my desk. "I know it feels overwhelming, but we can break it down into manageable pieces." For the next hour, I helped Helen organize her husband's medical information, explain the difference between Medicare Parts A, B, C, and D, and showed her how to appeal the insurance denials she had received. I gave her a folder with contact information for specialists who accepted her insurance, a calendar for tracking appointments, and a medication log to help prevent dangerous interactions. But more than the practical assistance, I gave her something I had desperately needed during my own caregiving years: the reassurance that she wasn't alone, that her confusion was normal, and that there were people who understood what she was going through. "You've been so helpful," she said as she prepared to leave. "How did you learn all this?" "The same way you're learning it now," I replied. "By needing to know it and not giving up until I figured it out." After she left, I sat at my desk feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. The knowledge I had gained through years of struggle was now helping another family avoid some of that same struggle. The pain I had endured while caring for Frank had been transformed into something useful, something that could ease someone else's burden. It felt like alchemy, turning suffering into service, confusion into clarity, isolation into connection. Over the following weeks, I worked with dozens of families facing similar challenges. Each case was different, but the underlying themes were always the same: people who loved each other trying to navigate systems that seemed designed to be incomprehensible, families struggling to maintain dignity and hope in the face of devastating diagnoses, caregivers who felt isolated and overwhelmed. I knew exactly how they felt because I had been exactly where they were. And that shared experience created a connection that no amount of professional training could replicate. 3 months into the job, Jennifer called me into her office with news that would change everything again. "I have a proposition for you," she said. "We've been awarded a grant to develop a new program specifically for family caregivers. Support groups, educational workshops, respite services, the whole package. I'd like you to coordinate it." The offer was both thrilling and terrifying. It would mean more responsibility, more visibility, more opportunity to make a difference. It would also mean acknowledging publicly that I had expertise worth sharing, that my experience had value beyond my own family. "I don't have a degree in social work or counseling," I said. "Are you sure I'm qualified?" Jennifer smiled. "Chantel, you have something more valuable than a degree. You have lived experience combined with natural empathy and problem-solving skills. You understand these families in a way that someone who learned about caregiving from textbooks never could." I thought about Mrs. Kim, about all the families I had helped over the past 3 months. I thought about how different my own caregiving experience might have been if I had access to the kind of support I was now providing to others. "Yes," I said. "I'd like to try." Walking out of Jennifer's office, I felt like I was floating again, but this time it was different. This wasn't just about having a job, it was about having a purpose that aligned with my values and utilized my hard-won expertise. I called Linda to share the news, and her excitement was infectious. "Chantel, this is incredible. 6 months ago, you were convinced you had no skills, and now you're going to be running your own program." "I can hardly believe it myself," I admitted. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life." "You're living your own life," Linda corrected gently. Maybe for the first time in decades, you're actually living your own life. That evening, I sat in my small apartment and thought about the journey that had brought me here. 6 months ago, I had been a woman fleeing from the word useless, with no plan and no hope. Now I was a professional with responsibilities and colleagues who respected my expertise. But more than the external changes, I was different inside. I had learned to value myself, to see my experience as valuable rather than simply expected. I had discovered that being useful and being valued were completely different things, and that I deserved both. Harold called later that evening, his voice strained with something I couldn't quite identify. "I heard from Sarah that you got some kind of promotion," he said without preamble. "It's a new program I'll be coordinating," I replied, proud of how confident I sounded. "Coordinating what exactly?" "Support services for family caregivers. People like I used to be." There was a long pause. "I never knew you felt like you needed support," he said finally. The comment was so oblivious, so completely lacking in self-awareness, that I almost laughed. "Harold, I was drowning for 12 years, and you never once asked if I needed help. You just kept piling on more criticism when I couldn't keep up." "I didn't realize." "You didn't want to realize. It was easier to blame me for struggling than to acknowledge that the situation was impossible." Another pause. "Dad's in a nursing home now," he said quietly. "I couldn't manage his care the way you did." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said and meant it. "How is he adjusting?" "Better than I expected. The staff is very good, and he seems to like the routine. He asks about you sometimes." The information hit me harder than I expected. I had worried about Frank constantly in the months since I left, wondering if he was receiving good care, if he understood why I had gone. "Would it be all right if I visited him sometime?" I asked. "I think he'd like that," Harold said. "I think he'd like to see how well you're doing." It was the closest thing to approval I had ever received from him, and while it felt good, I realized I no longer needed it. The woman who had left that house 6 months earlier had been seeking escape from Harold's judgment. The woman I had become had learned to trust her own judgment instead. The Family Caregiver Support Program launched 6 months later with a ceremony attended by local politicians, healthcare administrators, and community leaders. I stood at the podium in my navy blue suit, looking out at an audience of people who saw me as an expert, a professional, someone whose opinion mattered. The transformation still felt surreal sometimes. 9 months earlier, I had been invisible, useful only for my ability to manage other people's needs. Now I was the featured speaker at a program launch, my picture in the local newspaper, my expertise sought after by organizations across the state. Caregiving is often called a labor of love. I began my remarks, my voice clear and confident. But love doesn't teach you how to navigate insurance bureaucracy. Love doesn't tell you which questions to ask doctors or how to prevent medication errors. Love doesn't prepare you for the physical and emotional toll of watching someone you care about deteriorate. I paused, looking around the room at faces that reflected understanding and recognition. What caregivers need, in addition to love, is information, support, and the recognition that what they're doing is both valuable and incredibly difficult. They need to know that it's okay to ask for help, that seeking respite doesn't mean they're giving up, and that their own well-being matters too. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but more meaningful to me were the nods of understanding from the caregivers in the audience, people who had lived what I was describing. After the ceremony, a reporter from the local newspaper asked to interview me about my background and what had led me to this work. "I spent 12 years as a family caregiver myself," I explained. "It was the hardest and most important work I've ever done, but I did it in isolation, without support or recognition. I don't want other families to struggle the way mine did." The article appeared the following Sunday with the headline, "Former Caregiver Turns Experience into Expertise." There was a photo of me at my desk, looking professional and confident, with a caption that described me as a valuable resource for local families. Reading about myself in those terms felt like looking at a stranger, but a stranger I was proud to become. The woman in the article had expertise, authority, value that existed independent of her usefulness to others. The program's success exceeded everyone's expectations. Within 6 months, we were serving over 200 families, providing everything from respite care to educational workshops to support groups. The grant that had funded our startup was renewed and expanded, and I was invited to speak at conferences across California about developing community-based caregiver support. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from the families themselves. Letters and phone calls from people whose lives had been changed by our services, caregivers who felt less alone, elderly people who were receiving better care because their families had better support. One letter in particular stayed with me. It was from a woman named Maria Rodriguez, whose husband had Parkinson's disease and whose adult son had developmental disabilities. When I first met her, she was on the verge of a breakdown, trying to care for both of them while working part-time to make ends meet. "Before I found your program," she wrote, "I thought I was going crazy. I felt like a failure because I couldn't handle everything perfectly. You helped me understand that perfection isn't the goal, survival is. More than that, you helped me remember that I matter too. For the first time in years, I feel like a person instead of just a caregiver." Stories like Maria's reminded me why this work was so important. We weren't just providing services. We were helping people reclaim their sense of self-worth, their right to matter, their permission to value themselves. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had learned these lessons by being stripped of everything that had once defined my worth. Being called useless had forced me to discover what I was actually worth, which turned out to be far more than I had ever imagined. A year into running the program, I received an invitation that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. The California Department of Aging wanted me to serve on a statewide task force developing new policies for family caregiver support. My expertise, my lived experience, was being sought at the highest levels of government. The first meeting was in Sacramento, in a conference room filled with PhDs and policy experts and healthcare executives. I walked in wearing my navy blue suit, carrying a briefcase filled with data about our program's outcomes, and felt like I belonged there. When I introduced myself to the group, I said, "I'm Chantel Morrison. I coordinate the Family Caregiver Support Program in Kern County, and I bring the perspective of someone who spent 12 years as a family caregiver before finding my way into professional advocacy." No apologies for my lack of formal credentials. No diminishment of my experience. Just a clear statement of who I was and what I brought to the table. The task force meetings became a regular part of my schedule, along with speaking engagements and site visits to other programs around the state. I was becoming something I had never imagined, a recognized expert in caregiver support, someone whose opinion was valued by people who shaped policy and allocated resources. But the real measure of my transformation wasn't professional recognition or media attention. It was the way I felt about myself when I woke up each morning. I mattered, not because of what I could do for others, but because of who I was. I had value that existed independent of my usefulness, worth that no one else could define or diminish. I had learned the difference between being needed and being valued, and I had chosen to be valued. The apartment I had rented with my first paycheck had become a home. I had painted the walls in colors I loved, hung artwork that spoke to me, filled the space with things that brought me joy rather than things that served a function. I had even set up a small art studio in the second bedroom, complete with an easel and watercolor supplies I had bought for myself. Painting again after so many years felt like reconnecting with a lost part of my soul. My hands remembered the motions. My eyes still knew how to see color and light and composition. The paintings I created weren't masterpieces, but they were mine, expressions of a creativity that had been dormant but never dead. One evening, as I was working on a landscape inspired by the view from my office window, I realized that I was humming. Actually humming, something I hadn't done in years. It was such a small thing, but it represented something enormous. Contentment. I was content with my life, happy with my choices, proud of what I had built. My relationship with my children had evolved slowly, but significantly. David had visited twice, both times expressing amazement at the life I had created. "I never knew you had it in you, Mom," he said during his second visit. "I mean, I always knew you were smart and capable, but I never imagined you as a professional, as someone who would be quoted in newspapers and invited to speak at conferences." Sarah was slower to come around, still carrying guilt about not supporting my decision to leave Harold. But even she had begun to acknowledge that I seemed happier, more alive, more like the mother she remembered from her childhood. "You laugh again," she said during one of our phone calls. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I heard you really laugh. The observation struck me deeply. When had I stopped laughing? When had joy become so foreign to my daily experience that its return was remarkable to my own daughter? But I was laughing now, often and easily. With my colleagues at work, with the friends I had made through the Silver Connections program, with clients who found hope in our services. Laughter had returned to my life along with purpose and self-respect. 2 years after walking out of Harold's house, I attended a conference in San Francisco where I was the keynote speaker. The topic was transforming personal experience into professional expertise, and I was being presented as a case study in successful career transition later in life. Standing on that stage, looking out at an audience of several hundred people who had come to hear what I had to say, I thought about the woman who had fled into the night with nothing but a suitcase and wounded pride. She could never have imagined this moment, could never have conceived that her pain could become purpose, her struggle could become strength. 2 years ago, I told the audience, I was called useless so many times that I started to believe it. I thought my worth was tied to my ability to serve others without complaint, to be needed without being valued. I thought that useful and important were the same thing. I paused, making eye contact with faces throughout the audience. I was wrong. Being useful to others is a gift we can choose to give, but it's not the measure of our worth. Our worth exists independently of what we can do for anyone else. It exists because we are human beings with inherent dignity and value. The standing ovation that followed felt like absolution, like forgiveness for all the years I had undervalued myself. But more than that, it felt like recognition of a truth I had discovered through necessity, that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. After the conference, I treated myself to dinner at an elegant restaurant overlooking the bay. Sitting alone at a table for one, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and pink, I felt profoundly grateful for the journey that had brought me here. I thought about Harold, still living in that house in Bakersfield, still probably complaining about everything wrong with the world. I felt no anger toward him anymore, just a kind of sad recognition that he had never learned to see value in anything that didn't serve his immediate needs. I thought about Frank, who had passed away 6 months earlier while I was giving a presentation in Los Angeles. I had rushed to the funeral, where Harold greeted me with something approaching respect, and the nursing home staff spoke of Frank's frequent mentions of that nice lady Chantel who used to take such good care of me. Frank's death had been a reminder that all our struggles are temporary, that the time we have to matter is limited and precious. I was determined not to waste any more of mine being small when I could be significant, being useful when I could be valuable. My phone buzzed with a text from Linda. "Saw you on the news. So proud of my friend the expert. Dinner tomorrow to celebrate."
Friends.
The words still felt miraculous to me. I had friends now, people who chose to spend time with me because they enjoyed my company, because they valued who I was rather than what I could do for them. Tomorrow I would fly back to Bakersfield and return to my regular routine of program coordination and family support and policy development. It was work that mattered, Work that utilized every skill I had developed through decades of caregiving, work that paid me fairly for expertise I had earned through experience. But tonight, I was simply a woman having dinner alone by choice, watching a beautiful sunset, planning a future that belonged entirely to her. I was no longer useful. I was valuable. And that had made all the difference. 3 years after walking out of Harold's house with nothing but a suitcase and wounded pride, I stood in the lobby of the California State Capitol building, adjusting my pearl necklace and checking my watch. I was scheduled to testify before the Assembly Committee on Aging about proposed legislation that would provide state funding for family caregiver support programs statewide. The woman reflected in the marble walls looked nothing like the exhausted, invisible caregiver who had once defined herself entirely by her usefulness to others. She wore a tailored charcoal gray suit that spoke of professional competence, carried a leather briefcase filled with data and recommendations, and moved with the confidence of someone who belonged in rooms where important decisions were made. I had been invited to testify not as a curiosity or a feel-good story, but as a recognized expert whose opinion carried weight with policymakers. My program in Kern County had become a model for the state, and I had been instrumental in developing the standards and best practices that would guide implementation across California. Ms. Morrison? A young aide approached with a warm smile. The committee is ready for you. I followed her into the hearing room, my heels clicking against the polished floor with authority. The committee members, mostly middle-aged politicians who had probably never changed an adult diaper or navigated Medicare bureaucracy, looked up expectantly as I took my seat at the witness table. "Good morning," I began, my voice clear and confident. "My name is Chantel Morrison, and I serve as Director of Caregiver Services for the Kern County Senior Resource Center. I'm here today to speak in favor of Assembly Bill 1247, which would provide crucial funding for family caregiver support programs across California." I looked around the room, making eye contact with each committee member. But before I share statistics about program effectiveness and cost savings, I want you to understand why this legislation matters. 3 years ago, I was one of California's invisible caregivers, providing round-the-clock care for my father-in-law while my own needs and well-being were completely ignored by everyone, including myself. I told them about the isolation, the exhaustion, the way caregiving had gradually erased my sense of self. I told them about families I had worked with who were facing the same challenges, multiplied across the millions of Californians who provided unpaid care for aging relatives. Family caregivers save the state billions of dollars every year, I continued, referencing the data in my briefcase. But we're asking them to do it without support, without training, without respite. We're asking them to sacrifice their own health, their careers, their well-being for the greater good. And then we act surprised when they burn out, when they can't continue, when they need services we could have prevented. The committee members were listening intently now, several taking notes. The programs outlined in this bill don't just help caregivers. They help the people they care for. They help families stay together longer, and they save taxpayers money by preventing premature institutionalization. But most importantly, they recognize that family caregivers are human beings with value beyond their utility to others. When I finished my testimony, the committee chair thanked me for my compelling and informative presentation. Several members asked thoughtful questions about implementation timelines and outcome measures. They treated me like the expert I had become, someone whose opinion mattered in shaping policy that would affect thousands of lives. The bill passed committee unanimously and went on to become law 6 months later. When the governor signed it in a ceremony at the state capitol, I was invited to stand behind him as he put pen to paper, one of the key advocates whose work had made the legislation possible. That evening, I called Linda from my hotel room in Sacramento to share the news. "I still can't believe this is your life," she said, her voice warm with affection and pride. "Do you remember that first day at Silver Connections, when you could barely figure out how to turn on a computer?" I remember feeling like my life was over, I replied. Like I had waited too long to matter. And now you're literally changing state policy. You're affecting the lives of thousands of families you'll never meet. The scope of my influence still amazed me sometimes. The woman who had once believed her only value lay in quietly serving others had become a voice for caregivers across California. My expertise was sought by researchers, my programs were replicated in other states, my story was featured in academic journals and policy papers. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source: Harold. I hadn't spoken to him in over a year when he called me on a Tuesday evening in December. "Chantel," he said, his voice tentative in a way I had never heard before. "I hope it's okay that I called. I got your number from Sarah." "It's fine, Harold. How are you?" He paused, searching for words. "I'm calling to apologize. Really apologize, not like before when I just wanted you to come back." I waited, curious about what had prompted this change. "I've been going to counseling," he continued. "After Dad died, I realized I was completely alone, and I started thinking about why. The therapist has helped me understand some things about how I treated you, how I treated our marriage." "I'm glad you're getting help," I said, and meant it. "I saw the article about you in the Los Angeles Times. The one about your program expanding statewide. I showed it to the therapist, and she asked me how I felt about your success." "And how did you feel?" "Proud," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "And ashamed. Proud of what you've accomplished, ashamed of how I tried to keep you small. I called you useless, Chantel, when you were the most capable person I knew. I was just too threatened by your competence to admit it. The apology I had once desperately wanted felt almost anticlimactic now. I had moved so far beyond needing Harold's validation that his recognition of my worth felt like too little, too late." "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "It means something even now." "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quickly. "I know I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what I lost when I drove you away. And I wanted you to know how proud I am of the life you've built." After we hung up, I sat in my living room, looking at the framed photographs and awards that documented my transformation. Harold's apology was validation, but it wasn't what made me proud of my journey. What made me proud was the knowledge that I had saved myself, that I had found my worth independent of anyone else's opinion. The following month, I received an invitation that represented the pinnacle of professional recognition. The National Association of Area Agencies on Aging wanted me to deliver the keynote address at their annual conference. I would be speaking to over 3,000 professionals from across the country about innovative approaches to caregiver support. Standing on that stage in Las Vegas, looking out at an audience that included the most respected names in aging services, I felt the full weight of how far I had traveled. 5 years ago, I was changing adult diapers at 3 a.m. while being told I was useless. Today, I'm here talking to you about the value of family caregivers and the programs that support them. This transformation didn't happen because someone rescued me or because I got lucky. It happened because I decided I was worth rescuing. I talked about the millions of family caregivers who were invisible in their communities, unrecognized by policymakers, unsupported by systems that depended on their unpaid labor. I talked about the programs we had developed and the outcomes we had achieved and the potential for scaling these interventions nationally. But mostly, I talked about the fundamental human dignity of every person who chooses to care for others and society's obligation to care for them in return. When we support family caregivers, I concluded, we're not just providing services. We're acknowledging that every person has value beyond their utility to others. We're saying that your well-being matters, that your dreams matter, that you matter. Sometimes, that's the most important message anyone can receive. The standing ovation lasted almost 5 minutes. Afterward, I was surrounded by people who wanted to learn more about our programs, researchers who wanted to study our methods, administrators who wanted to hire me to help develop similar services in their communities. But the moment that meant the most came when a woman about my age approached me with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "I've been caring for my husband with dementia for 8 years, and I've forgotten who I am outside of that role. Listening to you today reminded me that I'm still a person, that I still matter." I hugged her tightly, remembering my own journey from invisible caregiver to recognized expert, from useful to valuable, from diminished to empowered. "You matter," I told her. "You've always mattered. Sometimes we just need to remember that." Flying home to California the next day, I thought about the trajectory that had brought me to this moment. The path from Harold's bedroom to that keynote stage hadn't been straight or easy. There had been setbacks and moments of doubt, times when I wondered if I was fooling myself about my capabilities or my worth. But I had persisted, driven by a stubborn belief that the woman who had been called useless might actually have something valuable to offer the world. That belief had been tested repeatedly, but it had ultimately been proven correct in ways I never could have imagined. My phone buzzed with messages from friends and colleagues who had watched the live stream of my keynote. Linda had sent a photo of herself and Janet and Rose watching from Linda's living room, all of them beaming with pride. "That's our friend," the caption read. Sarah had texted, "Watched your speech, Mom. I finally understand why you had to leave. I'm sorry it took me so long to see what you were becoming." David had sent a longer message. "I used to worry about you after you left Dad. I thought you were making a huge mistake, throwing away security for uncertainty. Now I realize you weren't throwing anything away. You were choosing yourself for the first time in your adult life. I'm so proud of the woman you've become." But the message that meant the most came from Maria Rodriguez, the caregiver whose letter had touched me so deeply years earlier. "Dr. Morrison, yes, I know you don't have a PhD, but you're a doctor of life experience. I watched your speech today with my support group. We all cried. Thank you for showing us that it's possible to matter, even when the world tells us we don't." Dr. Morrison. The title made me smile. I might not have formal credentials, but I had earned my expertise through lived experience, through struggle, through the determination to transform pain into purpose. As the plane descended toward Bakersfield, I could see the familiar landscape spreading out below. The mountains, the valley, the grid of streets that included the neighborhood where I had once lived as Harold's useful wife. That woman felt like a stranger to me now, someone I had known long ago but had outgrown completely. Tomorrow I would return to my office, to the program I had built, to the families depending on our services. I would continue the work of supporting caregivers, of advocating for policies that recognized their value, of building systems that honored their dignity. But tonight, I would sit in my apartment, the home I had created for myself, and paint. I would mix colors on my palette and watch them flow across canvas, creating something beautiful simply because I wanted it to exist. I was no longer the woman who had been called useless. I was no longer the woman who had defined herself by her utility to others. I was Chantel Morrison, expert, advocate, artist, friend. I was a woman who had learned the difference between being needed and being valued, and who had chosen to be valued. And that choice, that simple but revolutionary decision to matter to myself, had changed everything. 5 years after walking out of Harold's house with nothing but a suitcase and wounded pride, I stood in my own home, preparing for a celebration I never could have imagined. The invitation had arrived on official letterhead from the White House, requesting my presence at a ceremony honoring champions of aging innovation who had made significant contributions to improving the lives of older Americans. The woman adjusting her earrings in the mirror looked nothing like the exhausted caregiver who had once believed her only value lay in silent service. At 77, I carried myself with the confidence of someone who had learned her worth the hard way and never forgotten the lesson. My house, which I had purchased 2 years earlier with savings from my consulting work, reflected the life I had built for myself. The living room walls were covered with my own paintings, landscapes, and portraits that captured the beauty I had rediscovered in the world. The bookshelves held volumes on gerontology and caregiving policy alongside novels I read for pleasure and art books that inspired my creative work. In the corner sat my easel, where I painted most evenings after work, losing myself in color and light the way I had as a young woman. The paintings weren't masterpieces, but they were mine, expressions of a creativity that had survived decades of dormancy. The doorbell rang, interrupting my reflection. Linda stood on my front porch holding a bottle of champagne and wearing the kind of smile that suggested she had news to share. "Are you ready for Washington?" she asked, following me into the kitchen that I had designed according to my own preferences. Bright, functional, filled with gadgets I enjoyed using to cook meals I actually wanted to eat. "As ready as I can be," I said, retrieving glasses from the cabinet. "What's the champagne for?" "My book contract was finalized today," she announced, her voice sparkling with excitement. "The memoir about starting over in your 60s. My editor says it could help a lot of women who think it's too late to change their lives." We toasted to new beginnings, to the courage it takes to start over, to the unexpected joys of discovering who you are when no one else is defining you. Linda's transformation had been as remarkable as my own. The shy, recently widowed woman I had met in computer class had become a confident writer whose work was being published by a major house. "I have something to tell you, too," I said, settling into the chair I had positioned by the window specifically because it caught the afternoon light perfectly. "I've been asked to establish a national center for family caregiver research and training. The funding comes from 3 major foundations, and I'd be the founding director." Linda's eyes widened. "Chantel, that's incredible. Where would it be based?" "I get to choose. The foundations want me to select a location that makes sense strategically, but the final decision is mine." The offer had come as a complete surprise, delivered during a phone call that began as a request for consultation and ended as a job offer that would position me as one of the leading authorities on caregiver support in the country. "I keep thinking about that first day at Silver Connections," Linda said, shaking her head in amazement. "You could barely send an email, and now you're being offered the chance to lead a national center." "I keep thinking about Harold calling me useless," I replied. "If he could see me now, accepting an award at the White House, running programs across multiple states, being quoted in the New York Times. Do you think he would admit he was wrong?" I considered the question carefully. Harold and I had spoken sporadically over the years, conversations that had evolved from hostile to cordial to something approaching mutual respect. He had followed my career with what seemed like genuine pride, though he had never directly acknowledged the irony of calling his useless wife a recognized expert. "I think he's learned something about the difference between useful and valuable," I said finally. "His therapist helped him understand that he was threatened by my competence because it made him feel unnecessary. He needed me to be smaller, so he could feel bigger. And now he's learned to find his own sense of purpose. He volunteers at the senior center, helps other men whose wives have died or left them. He's discovered that being useful to others doesn't require making them feel useless." The evolution of Harold's character had been one of the unexpected developments of recent years. The man who had once diminished me to feel important had learned to find importance through genuine service to others. His apologies had become more sincere, his recognition of my accomplishments more generous. Not that it mattered for my sense of self-worth. I had moved so far beyond needing Harold's validation that his approval felt nice, but unnecessary. The woman who had once desperately sought his recognition now generated her own sense of value through work that mattered and relationships that nourished her. My phone rang, and I was surprised to see Sarah's name on the display. My relationship with my children had healed gradually over the years, but Sarah still struggled with guilt about not supporting my decision to leave Harold. "Hi, Mom," Sarah said, her voice warm with excitement. "I just wanted to call before your trip to Washington. I'm so proud of you." "Thank you, sweetheart. How are things in Phoenix?" "Good. Actually, great. I wanted you to know that I've been telling everyone about your White House ceremony. My colleagues, the other parents at Emma's school, even people at the grocery store. I can't help myself. I'm just so proud to be your daughter." The comment touched something deep in my chest. For so many years, my children had seemed embarrassed by my limitations, frustrated by my inability to be the mother they thought they needed. Now Sarah spoke of me with pride, as if having a mother who had rebuilt her life from scratch was something to celebrate rather than endure. "I also wanted to apologize again," Sarah continued, "for not understanding what you were doing when you left Dad, for thinking you were having a breakdown instead of a breakthrough." "You don't need to keep apologizing," I said gently. "You couldn't see what I was becoming, because I couldn't see it either. We were all just trying to make sense of a situation none of us had experienced before." "I know, but I should have trusted you more. You had always been the strongest person I knew, even when you didn't seem to know it yourself." After we hung up, I sat looking at my paintings and thinking about the conversation. My children's approval meant something to me, but it wasn't the desperate need it had once been. I had learned to be proud of myself first, and that internal validation had made external recognition a gift rather than a necessity. The next morning, I flew to Washington wearing a suit I had bought specifically for formal occasions. It was deep burgundy, a color Harold had once said was too bold for me, but that I thought made me look powerful and confident. The woman who walked through Reagan National Airport carried herself like someone who belonged in important places, who had earned the right to be heard. The White House ceremony was smaller than I had expected, more intimate. 25 people from across the country, each representing a different approach to improving the lives of older Americans. I was the only one without advanced degrees, the only one whose expertise came from lived experience rather than academic study. But when the president spoke about each honoree, my introduction was the longest and most detailed. He talked about the programs I had developed, the policies I had influenced, the thousands of families who had been helped by my work. He spoke about the transformation from family caregiver to national expert as an example of the resilience and innovation that defined American character. Chantel Morrison reminds us that expertise comes in many forms, he said, looking directly at me. Sometimes the most important knowledge comes not from textbooks but from experience, not from laboratories but from living rooms, not from research but from reality. Standing in the East Room of the White House, surrounded by people who had spent their careers in service to others, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The path from Harold's bedroom to this ceremony had been longer and more difficult than I could have imagined, but it had led to possibilities I never would have dared to dream. The woman who had been called useless had become useful in ways that mattered to thousands of people. More importantly, she had learned that her value existed independent of her usefulness, that she mattered simply because she was human. After the ceremony, I walked through the White House gardens in the late afternoon sunlight, my medal heavy in my purse, my phone buzzing with congratulations from friends and colleagues across the country. But the message that meant the most came from an unexpected source, a text from Betty, the woman who had given me that first flyer for Silver Connections in a grocery store parking lot 5 years earlier. "Saw you on the news at the White House," she wrote. "I told my granddaughter that I was the one who gave you that business card that started everything. She says I should get an assist on your award. I think she's right." Betty's comment made me laugh out loud in the rose garden. She was right in a way. Her simple act of kindness, her willingness to see potential in a desperate woman crying in a parking lot, had set everything else in motion. That evening, I had dinner alone at an elegant restaurant near my hotel, a habit I had developed during my travels. Sitting by myself at a table for one no longer felt lonely or awkward. It felt like a choice, like freedom, like the privilege of someone who enjoyed her own company. I thought about all the versions of myself I had been over the past 77 years. The young woman who had married Harold believing that love meant making yourself smaller so someone else could be bigger. The mother who had poured herself into her children's lives until her own dreams seemed selfish and unrealistic. The caregiver who had managed complex medical needs with skill and dedication while being told she was useless. Each of those versions had prepared me for who I was becoming, a woman who understood that service and sacrifice, while noble, were only meaningful when freely chosen rather than automatically expected. A woman who had learned that being needed and being valued were completely different things. A woman who had discovered that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. My phone buzzed with a call from Maria Rodriguez, the caregiver whose transformation had paralleled my own over the years. She was now a peer counselor in our program, helping other families navigate the challenges she had once faced alone. "Dr. Morrison," she said, using the honorary title the caregivers in our program had bestowed on me, "I had to call and tell you how proud we all are." The whole support group watched the ceremony online. We were crying and cheering like you were our own family member. "You are my family," I replied, meaning it completely. "All of you. You're the family I chose, the family that sees my value instead of just my usefulness." "I need to tell you something," Maria continued. "Today marks 3 years since my husband moved into memory care. 3 years since I got my life back. And it's all because you showed me that I mattered too, that taking care of myself wasn't selfish." After we hung up, I sat in the restaurant thinking about the ripple effects of transformation. My journey from invisible caregiver to recognized expert hadn't just changed my life. It had touched hundreds of other lives, created possibilities for people who had felt as trapped and worthless as I once had. The next morning, I flew back to California and drove straight to Frank's grave. I hadn't visited in months, caught up in the demands of my expanding work, but the White House ceremony had reminded me of how this journey began. Standing beside his headstone in the quiet cemetery, I told him about the award, about the national center I would be establishing, about the thousands of families who were receiving better support because of programs we had developed. "I hope you're proud of what came out of those years," I said aloud, feeling only slightly self-conscious about talking to a grave. "I hope you understand that I had to leave to become who I was meant to be, but I never stopped caring about you." A warm breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree shading his grave, and I chose to interpret it as approval. Driving home, I passed the house where Harold still lived, smaller now without the medical equipment and hospital bed that had dominated the space for so many years. I felt no bitterness toward him anymore, just a kind of sad recognition that he had never learned to see value in anything that didn't serve his immediate needs. But he was learning, slowly. His volunteer work at the senior center had given him purpose and perspective. He had told me during our last conversation that helping other widowed men navigate their grief had taught him empathy he wished he had possessed during our marriage. "I understand now what I put you through," he had said. "Not just the work, but the isolation, the feeling that your needs didn't matter. I'm trying to be different with the people I help now." It was as close to a complete apology as Harold was capable of giving, and it was enough. I had forgiven him not for his sake but for mine, understanding that carrying anger would only diminish the joy I had found in my new life. That evening, I sat in my studio working on a painting I had started weeks earlier. It was a self-portrait, but not in the traditional sense. Instead of depicting my physical appearance, I was painting the journey itself. Layers of color representing different phases of my life, from the muted grays of my caregiving years to the bold, vibrant hues of my current existence. The painting wasn't finished, and I wasn't sure it ever would be. Like my life, it was a work in progress, always evolving. always becoming something new. As I painted, I thought about the national center I would be establishing, the research we would conduct, the policies we would influence, the caregivers we would support. The work felt overwhelming and exciting in equal measure, a chance to impact the field at a scale I had never imagined possible. But I also thought about smaller things. The support group I would continue facilitating every Tuesday evening, the individual families I would keep counseling, the friends I had dinner with every Friday night. These personal connections, these individual moments of human dignity being recognized and restored, were what gave the larger work its meaning. My phone chimed with a text from Janet. "Dinner Friday? Linda wants to celebrate your White House adventure, and Rose has news about her move to Oregon." Friday dinner with my chosen family, the women who had witnessed and supported my transformation from the very beginning. The routine had become sacred to me, a weekly reminder that I was valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. I typed back, "Wouldn't miss it. I have news too. Big news." The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls and emails as word of my White House honor spread through the networks I had built over 5 years of professional work. Colleagues congratulated me, reporters requested interviews, and organizations invited me to speak about my experience. But the call that meant the most came just before bedtime from David. "Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I watched the ceremony online today, and I kept thinking about something. When Sarah and I were kids, you used to tell us we could be anything we wanted when we grew up."
Do you remember that?
Of course I remember. I don't think I ever told you the same thing. I don't think any of us ever said that you could be anything you wanted. We just assumed you wanted to take care of everyone else. "You were children," I said gently. "It wasn't your job to worry about my dreams." But we stayed children in that way, didn't we? Even as adults, we kept assuming that taking care of everyone else was all you wanted to do. We never asked what you wanted for yourself. What made you think about this? Watching you today, seeing how far you've come, how much you've accomplished, I realized that you did become anything you wanted. You just had to wait until you were 72 to do it. After we hung up, I sat in my comfortable chair by the window, looking out at the garden I had planted with flowers chosen purely for their beauty rather than their practicality. Jasmine and roses and lavender filled the evening air with fragrance, a sensory pleasure I had denied myself for decades. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. The National Center to plan and establish. The research agenda to develop. The partnerships to build with universities and foundations and government agencies. The continuing work of changing how society viewed and supported family caregivers. But tonight, I was simply grateful for the journey that had brought me here. Grateful for Harold's cruelty, strange as that seemed, because it had forced me to discover my own strength. Grateful for Frank's illness, because it had taught me skills I never knew I possessed. Grateful for my children's initial lack of understanding, because it had forced me to stop seeking validation from others and start generating it from within. Most of all, I was grateful for the moment of rebellion that had changed everything, the night I had looked at Harold holding those diapers and medications and chosen myself for the first time in 47 years. That choice, that simple but revolutionary decision to matter to myself, had opened up possibilities I never could have imagined. It had led me from a cramped bedroom in Bakersfield to the East Room of the White House, from being called useless to being recognized as invaluable. But the external recognition, satisfying as it was, wasn't what made me proud of my journey. What made me proud was the knowledge that I had saved myself, that I had found my worth independent of anyone else's opinion, that I had learned the difference between being useful and being valuable. I picked up my phone and opened a new text message. For a moment, I considered sending it to Harold, to my children, to someone who had been part of the old story. Instead, I sent it to Linda, Janet, Rose, and Maria, the women who had witnessed and celebrated my becoming. 5 years ago tonight, I wrote, I walked out of a life that was making me smaller every day and into a future I couldn't imagine. Thank you for helping me remember that I was worth saving. Thank you for seeing my value when I had forgotten it existed. Thank you for being the family that chose me back. The responses came quickly, each one an affirmation of the bonds we had built through shared struggle and mutual support. Linda, you saved yourself, but we were honored to witness it. Janet, you taught us all what courage looks like. Rose, you showed us that it's never too late to matter. Maria, you gave me permission to value myself. That gift changed everything. I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, my White House medal on the dresser catching the moonlight streaming through the window. Tomorrow I would frame it and hang it on the wall with my other awards and recognitions, visual reminders of how far I had traveled from that desperate night 5 years ago. But the real measure of my transformation wasn't hanging on any wall. It lived in the families I had helped, the policies I had influenced, the programs I had created. It lived in the woman I saw in the mirror each morning, someone who had learned to value herself as much as she had always valued others. Harold had been wrong about me, not just about my competence or my worth, but about the fundamental nature of who I was. I wasn't useless. I wasn't diminished. I wasn't too old to matter or too late to change. I was exactly who I had always been, underneath all those years of trying to be what others needed. I was Chantel Morrison. Expert, advocate, artist, friend, and woman who had finally learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the most radical thing a woman can do is decide she matters. Sometimes the greatest rebellion is refusing to disappear. And sometimes the most powerful words you can say are not, I am useful, but I am valuable. My journey to discovering my own worth hadn't had an expiration date. It had started whenever I was ready to believe I deserved better. And I had deserved better. I always had. Thank you for joining us for Chantel's extraordinary story of courage and transformation. If her journey moved you, please subscribe to her journey for more real tales of women rising from the ashes of who they thought they had to be to become who they were meant to be. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to value yourself, that useful and valuable are not the same thing, and that the most important person to matter to is yourself. What's the comeback you dream of? What would happen if you stopped being useful to people who find you useless and started being valuable to yourself? Let us know in the comments, and remember, your true story is just getting started. Sometimes the most radical thing a woman can do is decide she matters. Sometimes the greatest rebellion is refusing to disappear. And sometimes the most powerful words you can say are not, I am useful, but I am valuable. Your journey to discovering your own worth doesn't have an expiration date. It starts whenever you're ready to believe you deserve better. And you do deserve better. You always have.